Hello everybody. I'm Natalie Wadley. I've been serving as the interim director of the Shawnee Tribe Cultural Center recently. My main job over there for the last couple of years has been the programs and events, or exhibits, not events, sorry, exhibits and programs manager. I actually met Steve pretty early on when I started working there because he came down for our first exhibit, and so we've worked back and forth quite a bit. So yeah, looks like we're all pretty good. Let me just check my notes. Let me introduce Steve Warren here. He's from the University of Iowa. If you have any questions during his presentation, which he'll get going here in just a minute, if you could type them into the chat box, and at the end, I'll kind of read off questions for him. So that way we'll just keep it pretty concise and straight through instead of trying to figure out everybody to speak. I apologize for any technical difficulties. So far, everything's been really smooth, but like it's always going to be one time. Our next lecture is Jim Lee. He's going to be sometime next month during a lunch lecture. We haven't solidified the date with him yet. He'll be talking about family genealogy, kind of relating back to his family and stuff. I believe is the topic that we've talked about him doing. And so this is Steve Warren's doing our presentation this evening, which we appreciate very much. He is the professor of history and chair of American Studies at the University of Iowa. He's both a teacher and scholar, currently teaching classes and chairing the American Studies department. He has worked with the Shawnee tribe for many years, having published several books on Shawnee history, including The Shawnee and Their Neighbors, The Worlds the Shawnees Made, Migration and Violence in Early America, co-authored along with the Shawnee chief Ben Barnes, the salvaging the salvage anthropologist, Ermine Wheeler Vogelin, Carl Vogelin, and the future of ethnohistory, among other, and these are among other published works that he has, kind of revolving around the history and current practices of the Shawnee tribe. He was also a consultant and commentator on a documentary about Tecumseh. Today's presentation, he's going to focus along some of his current work regarding Tecumseh and his role in U.S. history, and I'll kind of let him talk more about what he's going to talk about. So thank you, and I'll turn it over.
Okay, well, hi everyone. My name is Steve Warren, and thank you, Natalie, for that really kind introduction. I really appreciate it. This is going to be, I hope, a generative conversation. It's kind of a departure for me because I've been spending most of my career writing history of either the 19th century or early America. It's a departure because we're going to be looking at the 20th century today, and I'm going to try to understand why Ohioans in particular turned to the person of Tecumseh and continue to turn to the person of Tecumseh to work out questions related to their own identity as a state, their place in the nation. And so the sort of what I'm going to do is take you through what I'm calling three acts, or three moments in time across the 20th century when Tecumseh appears in Ohio in great force. And the central act of the presentation will be the Ohio Sesquicentennial, which took place in 1953. And so I'm really looking forward to talking with you about this, and I hope that when I'm done, we can have some time for questions, and hopefully you'll help me out. This is ongoing research, and so I'm really eager to learn more from you. And thank you again for sharing the time with me. And so what you're looking at here is a comic book that was created for the Ohio Sesquicentennial. It's a comic book called The Pioneers. And its central act is the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which took place in 1794 in northwestern Ohio. And as you can see, it's a celebration, really, of the kind of scorched earth campaigns that characterize the Kentuckians' invasion of Ohio from south to north. And so the 1953 Sesquicentennial really glorified violence against Native American and used that violence to sort of sanctify white people's possession of 20th century Ohio. Let's see, having a hard time moving my screen. And so I apologize for that. And so what I want to do is take us back before the sesquicentennial to this question of when and why did Shawnees begin returning to Ohio? You know, one of the things about Ohio is that if we place it alongside its neighbors, Illinois and Indiana, you will find that in those three states, there are no federally recognized Native nations remaining within their borders, Native nations headquartered within the borders. In my home state of Iowa, there's only one federally recognized Native nation that is headquartered in the state, and that is the Meskwaki. And so a characteristic of the lower Midwest is the extent of the removal of Native people, of that genocidal federal policy that was passed into law in 1830. And so it's puzzling at first glance when you think about just how pervasive, how dramatic and deadly Indian removal was in the lower Midwest. It's puzzling at first glance to think about why white Americans began returning to Native people, their histories, their living descendants in the 20th century. And what I found with regard to Ohio is that the first person to actually formally visit and be acknowledged by white Ohioans was Thomas Wildcat Alford. And his visits began in 1928 and continued on through the early 1930s. They were initiated by the man pictured here with Wildcat Alford. This is William Albert Galloway. And William Galloway was a medical doctor, a guy from Xenia, Ohio, which had been the site of one of the largest Chalagatha Shawnee villages. And in order to introduce himself to Galloway, what he did is he brought a tomahawk that was allegedly owned by Tecumseh and gifted to his great-grandfather, James Galloway, before Tecumseh's death at the Battle of Thames. And so Galloway brings this pipe and delivers it to Thomas Wildcat Alford, who was a direct descendant of Tecumseh. And the caption beneath this picture reads, taken at Shawnee, Oklahoma after the renewal of the Pact of Peace. And so interestingly, Galloway saw, a sort of reconciliation with Indian removal here. That his visit to Shawnee, Oklahoma, and to Thomas Wildcat Alford was a way to sort of set aside the racial animosity that went along with removing Native people from their homeland. And so this began or initiated a really strange relationship between William Albert Galloway and Thomas Wildcat Alford. In August 1928, Alford returned to Xenia and to Greene County, and he actually visited Galloway Sugar Creek Presbyterian Church, and he used the opportunity to raise money for the publication of the four Gospels. And so here you see a picture of that. So one of the very first texts ever published in the Shawnee language was actually published in Xenia, Ohio by William Albert Galloway. And it was church funds created by white folks that made it possible. This gospel has the Shawnee language and the English language side by side. And so it begs the question, who was Alfred and how did he manage Galloway's interest in Shawnee history? It's a real curiosity. As I shared with you previously, Galloway was a medical doctor, and he was essentially an amateur historian. There are many people who fit this description today. I often chuckle at the number of doctors and lawyers who take up history as a hobby, and Galloway certainly fit this description. Galloway was also a town booster, and so he was deeply invested in making Xenia kind of the center of Ohio's history, part of the origin story of the entire state. And in that, Galloway was pretty customary for the time. There were lots and lots of Midwesterners like Galloway who tried to use Native Americans to make a case for their town's significance, or in Galloway's case, for his family's significance. Because Galloway's great-grandfather, James, had been a Kentuckian. He was one of those men who participated in the scorched earth campaigns of Shawnee villages and who, it's hard to say, had some kind of a relationship with Tecumseh in his life. And so essentially, William Albert Galloway went to Alfred, went on a mission trying to find descendants of Tecumseh who would validate his understanding of his own family's history and of the significance of Xenia, Ohio, in particular. And so Thomas Wildcat Alford had an equally interesting history himself. He attended the Hampton Institute, so he was one of the first absentee Shawnees to leave Oklahoma. And he traveled all the way with another young man named Thomas King, and they traveled to Virginia, where they were in a boarding school that was, on the face of it, for enslaved peoples who had been liberated. And so Hampton Institute was founded by Booker T. Washington, but it also took in Native Americans and served as one of the first Indian boarding schools. And so Alfred came back to Oklahoma, as many boarding school people did, and came back as a Christian, advocated for the allotment of Oklahoma's reservations, believed that his people should convert to Christianity, should live on privately held land, and in his adult life, spent many years working in the Indian Service for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so based on this information, it's not as if Thomas Wildcat Alford was essentially a fair representative of the absentee Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma in 1931. He wasn't. He was very much an outlier of his people at that time. And so in Old Chillicothe, which is a book that William Galloway published in 1934, it was basically co-authored by Alfred. Alfred rebuked settler histories, writing that the white man has not heretofore sought us for our side of the story. He glorifies only in his own imagery of history. And I just love this quote because this could have been said yesterday by many of the Native people on this call. Perhaps you all shared this today. So there's been this ongoing critique, really, a justified critique of non-Native scholars and their misrepresentation of Native pasts. And clearly Alford what is part of this tradition. But what makes him, I think, interesting and important for us tonight is that there's a certain irony to his comments, because of course, Alford was an advocate of allotment. He was an advocate of the Christianization of his people. And he was a friend of William Galloway, a man who purposefully misrepresented Tecumseh. And we'll get into that in just a minute, sort of the depth of the misrepresentation. And so the irony of this is that in 1931, during one of Alfred's many visits to Ohio, Galloway erected several monuments to Tecumseh. And so the two of them got together and they put up these giant memorials to Tecumseh in Xenia that still stand to this day. And they represent what historian Kirk Savage describes as agendas, obsessions, prejudices, whims, and occasionally the high ideals and aspirations of those people in society who happen to have the power to erect them in public. And so Galloway and Alford were high status men of means, who had the ability to create their own record of Tecumseh in Xenia, Ohio. What's particularly troubling and tragic, and I mean, it's just that I apologize for the depth of the offense that I still have for this. And for those of you on the call who have to read this, I apologize. I think it's important. But during that 1931 visit, when they erected these monuments, William Galloway subjected his friend, Thomas Wildcat Alford, to this gruesome display. He had people in Xenia dig up a skeleton from a local mound. And they had a parade. They put the skeleton in a shiny brand new automobile, and they timed the skeleton's ride through downtown Xenia for October 5th, 1931, which was the centennial of the Shawnees' removal from Ohio and the anniversary of Tecumseh's death at the Battle of the Thames. And so the depth, the sort of the pathology and the cruelty of this action really makes their friendship confusing and hard to understand for us in the 21st century. One thing that is confusing to me, as I've shared previously, is why Native Americans? Why is it that across the Midwest, people such as William Albert Galloway turned to people such as Thomas Wildcat Alford, historical figures such as Tecumseh? And why did they claim Native people in this way? I mean, by taking the skeleton, by desecrating the grave, it was almost as if Galloway and the citizens of Xenia, Ohio, were claiming Native people as a kind of birthright, that they can do whatever they want, literally, with the Native person's remains. And so it's a particularly troubling characteristic of this long friendship between Alford and Galloway. But it's not at all that unusual, actually, because Galloway created his own myths about Tecumseh, myths that continue to be popular and highly regarded. in um, in Ohio. And a person who did that in Indiana is this man, the older person wearing the hat, Eli Lilly. He hired a team of archaeologists, Glenn Black, James Griffin, and George K. Newman, the ethnologists and linguists, Wheeler Vogelin and Carl Vogelin, and amateur historians, Paul Weir, to decode the Walam Olam. And so this later turned out to be a hoax, but Eli Lilly, who was the pharmaceutical magnate who literally developed insulin and made his fortune treating diabetes, was a hobbyist, a lot like William Albert Galloway. And so across the Midwest, we see figures such as Eli Lilly, such as William Albert Galloway, who become really involved in Native American history and kind of take it on as their own. And what's troubling and tragic, and what we should be, I think, thinking about is these men essentially established a record of Native American history that we still struggle with to this day. And so it sort of helps to know the backstory behind the individuals who created this scholarship. And so what William Galloway did is he invented a story about Tecumseh. And the story about Tecumseh had to do with an affair that never happened. It was an affair between Tecumseh and William Galloway's grandmother, Rebecca Galloway. And it was kind of, I think, a device that Galloway used to draw attention to Xenia, to draw attention to his family, to make a claim for the town's history and its importance. And it follows pretty closely this kind of Romeo and Juliet relationship. And what's central to the story is that it's always Tecumseh's fault for ending the relationship. And so no matter who tells the story, and as the slide points out, there are still authors writing books about the alleged relationship between Tecumseh and Rebecca Galloway to this day. But no matter who tells it, it's critically important that Tecumseh ultimately denies the match. You know, that Rebecca Galloway would have accepted him if only Tecumseh had decided to adopt her people's mode of life and dress. And so in Galloway's telling of the story, he attributes Tecumseh and faults Tecumseh for the failure of their relationship because he basically didn't want to bring shame upon his people. And so moving back before we move on to the second act, I want to say a little bit about this apocryphal, erroneous, false characterization of Tecumseh. He never had anything to do with Rebecca Galloway. Historians have studied his every move, and there's literally no record of this. But what's important then is that this is a fantasy of Tecumseh that is literally created out of whole cloth by white Ohioans. And what I find interesting about white Ohioans' description of this relationship is that Tecumseh as a person is frequently recast and recreated. And so in the 1930s version of Tecumseh, he is described as a person who originally goes to Rebecca Galloway in order to learn English. He is characterized as incredibly smart, as noble in bearing. He's a person who Rebecca's father, James Galloway, loves. And James Galloway is totally okay with the match. Even the dad says, yeah, let's, they can marry if they want to, right? And so it's interesting that his intelligence and his beauty, his physical beauty, and also his ability to take Rebecca's hand is granted by James Galloway. That all changes. All those aspects of Tecumseh as a person, those all change in the 1950s version of the Tecumseh and Galloway affair. And I want to get into that in just a minute. Let's see. For some reason, it sticks. And so let's see. In the second act, which is in 1952, 1953, Tecumseh becomes hugely popular once again. There's sort of a lull in Tecumseh lore in the late 1930s and the 1940s. And then suddenly there's a resurgence of Tecumseh as a person of great interest to white Ohioans. And I want to get into why that is. And my contention is that the interest in Native Americans is especially curious in 1953 because, as I shared previously, all federally recognized Native people had been removed from the state. And so there were Native people living there as individuals, but they made up far less than 1% of Ohio's population. So just on the basis of demographics, there really isn't a compelling reason to turn to Tecumseh. And the argument that I'd like to make is that the Sesquicentennial featured vanquished Native Americans who ultimately acceded to Indian removal. And this occurred at a time when urban renewal programs had convinced James Baldwin that, in his words, urban renewal was a kind of Negro removal program. Those are his words. He described urban renewal as Negro removal. And so he believed that African Americans have no place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country. And this is significant in Ohio because Ohio, between 1918 and 1953, was a primary site of what was called the Great Migration out of the South. And so African Americans flocked to cities such as Columbus, such as Cleveland, such as Toledo. And the African American population of the state of Ohio increased even more dramatically in the second wave of the Great Migration, which was this very small space between 1945 and 1953. In places such as Cleveland, in the second wave of the Great Migration, the African American population increased by approximately 200%. And figures like that are similar in Columbus and Ohio's other major cities. And so the point that I'd like to make is that Native people, and particularly the person of Tecumseh, became fascinating to Ohioans because it operated as a kind of racial script. And here I'm following the work of the historian Natalia Molina. And what she explains is that it's frequently the case that white people will sort of move a racial stereotype from one group of color to another. So they sort of jump the tracks. And so a prejudice that's typically directed toward Asian Americans will move toward the Latinx population, or a prejudice directed at Native Americans will move toward the African American population. And the argument really works with the Ohio Sesquicentennial, and I want to explain why. And so some of the fascinating thing about the Ohio Sesquicentennial is that it occurred at the height of the Cold War. And in the 1950s, there was a really profound association on the part of advocates of Jim Crow, white people who opposed integration in both the North and the South, tended to make arguments against integration by accusing civil rights activists of being communists. And so there were people who were really involved in the civil rights movement, white people in particular, named Richard and Anna Morgan, who ran bookstores in integrated downtown neighborhoods of Columbus, such as the Goodall District. And in these integrated neighborhoods, they were hotbeds of the civil rights movement. And what was characteristic of these neighborhoods is that they were low rents. They were very close to the factories of Columbus, and they were integrated neighborhoods. And these were the very neighborhoods that were targeted by urban renewal experts who wanted to remake the city of Columbus. And so Richard and Anna Morgan are particularly interested because Richard Morgan was the foremost expert on the archaeology of Ohio. And so there wasn't anyone in the state of Ohio at the time who knew more about Native people than Richard Morgan. Morgan worked for the Ohio Archaeological Society. He conducted digs in Ohio and Indiana. And his patrons were colleagues of a man that I shared with previously, Eli Lilly. And so his patrons were Republicans who were ardent anti-communists and planners of the Ohio Sesquicentennial. And so in 1946 and 1947, Richard Morgan's wife, Anna, became an outspoken leader of the city's Vanguard League, which fought against Jim Crow restaurants and segregated shop floors. And in January 1947, as chairman of the league, Anna Morgan compelled General Motors to fully integrate their factory so that Black workers were no longer consigned to the most menial, low-paying positions. And a lot of people sort of forget the fact that Jim Crow wasn't simply a Southern phenomenon, that Midwestern states such as Ohio were as invested in segregation as any other place. And so Richard, because his wife was a civil rights activist, became a target. He became caught up in the Cold War. And so his boss at the Ohio Archaeological Society was this man, Edwin Zepp. And at the direction of the city leaders of Columbus, Ohio, Zepp fired Richard Morgan, accusing him of being a communist. And they had his bookstore in the Goodall District raided and by a mob, in fact. And so there was sort of an erasing of progressive political figures in Ohio in the immediate eve of the Ohio Sesquicentennial. And it was Zepp who directed the employees of the Ohio Archaeological Society after Morgan's firing. He directed the employees of the Ohio Historical Society to describe Native people as villains that haunted the rural imagination. And so they made Tecumseh the central villain of the Ohio Sesquicentennial. And Zepp was a person who was really involved in a vision of solidarity around whiteness and citizenship. And so Native people became a means of distancing white Ohioans from Black Ohioans, from affirming the color line in Ohio. And so we know that African Americans were excluded from the Ohio Sesquicentennial because the Sesquicentennial Commission kept very careful records of the events that they planned. And in those records, you will be hard pressed to find any evidence commemorating Black Ohioans. And in response to their exclusion from the Sesquicentennial, leaders of historically Black colleges and universities in Ohio, such as Charles Harris Wesley, got together with Black leaders across the state and created their own pamphlets about Black Ohio. I mean, after all, it's really important to remember that Ohio's most famous writer ever is Toni Morrison, right? That Thomas Jefferson's African-American children, the Hemmingses, settled in Chillicothe, Ohio. And so Ohio has a very rich African-American history. And so its complete erasure from the Ohio Sesquicentennial is really puzzling. It's hard to make sense of. And so Wesley was really quick to point out that the result of race prejudice was unrealized potential, right? It was the failure of Ohio. And so in Tecumseh's second act, Tecumseh is made into a kind of a Cold War anti-hero. And if Galloway was really invested in local town histories and in promoting Xenia, in Tecumseh's second act, people like Edwin Zepp made Tecumseh into a sort of parable of American nationalism. And so the defeat of Tecumseh signaled Ohioans' triumph over Native Americans, such as Tecumseh, and it predicted subsequent victories over America's Cold War enemies. And so what the Sesquicentennial planners were doing here is they were attempting to kind of make Ohio and Ohio's history the epitome of America's universal power. And so here I want to return back to Tecumseh's second act and get into how Tecumseh changes in the Sesquicentennial. The Sesquicentennial planners hired one of the foremost playwrights, a champion of outdoor theater, a guy who was incredibly well known in the 1950s. His name was Paul Green. And Paul Green wrote a play named The 17th Star for the Sesquicentennial. It was an outdoor drama. And in Green's play, he relied on an Ohio storyteller, a guy named Frank Seidel, to help him tell the story. And I want you to take a look at this passage with me. And I hope that in our discussion, we can return to it. Remember, one of the characteristics of this fictitious affair between Galloway and Tecumseh is that it's always Tecumseh who turns Rebecca Galloway down. And in this version of the story, the 1953 version, Tecumseh anticipates his death and the destruction of his race. He explains in The 17th Star, the play written by Green, that always the many devour the few. Men are brothers only to the depth of the color of their faces. So Seidel made Ohio's foremost warrior acquiesce to the inevitability of the United States, to the white men who would literally change the face of the land. And so in the 1953 version, it's a very clear affirmation of white supremacy. in William Albert Galloway's version of the affair, there's no real issue with interracial love. Rebecca's father, James, says that it's fine with him. The marriage seems to be possible if it weren't for Tecumseh ultimately turning her down. But in 1953, Tecumseh is described as slow, as intellectually challenged, as really prone to instincts, to anger. He's really racialized and converted into some of the worst tropes associated with African Americans at the time. And so interracial love, or the color line, is really affirmed in the 17th star. And so I want to think with you in the coming moments in our discussion about, what's going on in these various acts, right? So in 1931, there's a gruesome display of human remains before a noted leader of the absentee Shawnee tribe. And then in the Sesquicentennial, there's a clear association that Ohio's past, present, and future are for white men to control and enjoy. And as this comic strip regarding the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 illustrates, right? The caption reads, General Mad Anthony Wayne organizes and leads the settlers against the Indians, and in 1794 they trap the savages and destroy them in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And so the Sesquicentennial absolutely perpetuates the vanishing Indian thesis and associates Native people with a distant historical past, denying Native people a future and a presence in modernity. And so in the third act of Tecumseh, it really begins in 1973. And the first manifestation of that is the play Tecumseh, which is adopted by or from Alan Eckert's book. It's based in Chillicothe, Ohio, and incredibly, the Ohio National Guard and the Ohio state government paid what today would be millions of dollars to build the amphitheater in Chillicothe that is now the home for one of the longest running plays about Tecumseh in the United States. It's been running continuously since 1973, and at least 2.5 million people have seen the play. And in this telling of the story, the Galloway and Tecumseh affair remains center stage, but the primary villain in this story is Tenskwatawa, Tecumseh's brother, the Shawnee prophet, and he receives much of the blame for the Battle of Tippecanoe, the battle in 1811 in which William Henry Harrison defeats a multinational, multi-tribal, force in Indiana. And so I think an equally scorned and equally misrepresented figure in these plays isn't just Tecumseh, it's Tenskwatawa, and by extension, all Shawnee people. And so historian Katrina Phillips explains that Tecumseh, in this third act, invites audiences to participate in a collective moment of mourning in a way that centers on Indigenous disappearance and American innocence. And so this is my final slide, and I want to think with you about what Katrina Phillips is getting at here. You know, there's this sort of desire in her perspective that white people continue to be fascinated by Native Americans, but only in a way that represents frontier era violence as sort of victimless somehow, a way that denies settler culpability. And what's really important about all of these representations, whether we're talking about William Albert Galloway's Old Chillicothe or the play Tecumseh today, is that Indian removal, that ultimate act of ethnic cleansing perpetrated by the United States government, is entirely ignored. And so a through line across all of that is a lack of acknowledgement of that federal policy of ethnic cleansing. And so I have no idea how long I shared. I think I'm just about on time. And so I'm going to stop now, and I would love to have a conversation with you all about this talk.
Thank you. Pull up the chat here. Okay, so Steve Roach earlier, kind of more of a just comment versus a question. He says that the Rebecca Galloway story reminds me of pretend Indians who claim indigeneity through lateral descent, e.g., a relative who married an indigenous person.
I think that's a great statement. I think it's absolutely true. And part of the way in which Ohioans and all Midwesterners claim a birthright to North America is by linking themselves to Native people. And so, you know, that you sort of can claim that you're the inheritor of Native people by either claiming a family connection or having a Native artifact, right? There's this way in which either Native people or Native material culture kind of legitimates your claim to the land as a settler. And so I totally agree with you, Stephen. That's a good point.
Yes. Okay. I just also messaged, because we're over on Facebook also, that they can ask some questions. How Emily Curdle, I believe is how you say your last name. Sorry if I butchered it. How can Ohio educators accurately teach the history of Native Americans in Ohio, especially keeping in mind that misinformation is so ingrained in both kids and adults / other educators? Just the white Ohioans are very often resistant to relearning.
Sure. Yeah, well, there are plenty of people on this call who can help you answer that question. But I think I would like to say that this presentation really focused on the sort of historical atrocities that have been visited upon the Shawnee and Tecumseh in particular. But it's also important to point out that there's some great work happening in Ohio, particularly at Newark Earthworks, at Serpent Mound. And I should add that the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society is no longer the ardent anti-communist Cold War era organization that I described to you in 1953. They're doing a really good job of reinterpreting many of Ohio's sites. And so there are lots of great resources in Ohio, and there are lots of Ohioans who are trying to do the right thing. But I think, you know, the takeaway from these mischaracterizations for me is in part that Americans have a really difficult time with difficult histories. And one of the things that I would urge everyone on the call to do is to dig into the complexity of it, because the truth is stranger than fiction. And these fictitious stories that we insist on telling ourselves um, don't really hold as much water or enough interest to warrant continuing to tell them.
Okay. So Brian Bird asks, do you think the Ohio governor's recent creation of a new skate park at Old Chicote, I think is how you say that, heralds the fourth act of your critique? And if so, what would you hope for in that?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually know a little bit about this park. And Katrina Phillips describes efforts such as this as salvage tourism. And in her perspective, what's happening when you have plays about Blue Jacket or about Tecumseh, you know, you have a problem in the rural Midwest, which is dying post-industrial small towns that are now part of the Rust Belt. And so they're trying to figure out a way to generate tourism, to bring people to their town. And in Ohio, one of the ways you do that is by centering your town around Native Americans. And so there are 38 historic sites in the state of Ohio, and I think that 30 of them focus on Native people. And so, Native people are really the way you try to revive your small town. And what I would urge the Shawnee tribe to do is to figure out how to require a consultation with these sites and these site managers so that they can do a better job. Because I think ultimately, one of the consequences of Indian removal is obviously the absence of federally recognized communities. And in that absence, you have white people essentially taking license with Native American history, writing whatever they want about Native people. And so in order to fix that, I think it's going to take the work of allies such as myself. But I also think it's going to take the work of federally recognized Native people reclaiming their homelands. So that's my thought about that.
Great. There we go. Carl was asking about good source to find real histories of Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa. How do you say his brother's name? It's got one too many syllables for me to like do it very well.
It's okay. That's okay. You work for the Shawnee tribe now.
Yeah,
so you have to live with the
and I try.
Of the mispronunciation.
And I get it. Yeah, it's like, yeah.
Well, I'm actually not, I wouldn't describe myself as a historian of Tecumseh. There are a number of non-native scholars who have written exhaustive books about Tecumseh. And so my mentor is R. David Edmonds. He wrote a short readable book about Tecumseh. John Sugden has written an exhaustive book about Tecumseh. There's a recent book that just came out this year by a journalist about Tecumseh that is terrible. I'm sorry that I can't remember the name of it right now, but it really abuses Tecumseh's memory. And I guess, my takeaway on these wildly variant representations of Tecumseh and the sort of focus on Tecumseh is, why do we do this? why do we continue returning to him? Why not focus on his survivors? Why not focus on the people who dealt with Indian removal, right? The people who made a way of life for themselves in Kansas or then in Oklahoma. And so, there are good books about Tecumseh out there, and you can certainly access them. But I would just urge everyone on the call to think of Native American history and Native American people from the past to the present, rather than focusing on a person who was killed in battle in 1813. I think there are other usable pasts that we can draw on.
And I don't know exactly what all we have on our website, but under, we have an FAQ section on the Shawnee Culture website that has a bibliography with sources that we've pulled from people who they're supposed, reliable resources about Shawnee history, whether that includes Tecumseh or not, just for everybody's information. And as we learn more, we add on to it. So it's a growing and evolving document. Sure. Because we get this question a lot, or questions similar.
Sure. Yeah, Shawnee history is way more than Tecumseh,
Yeah. And then I know one of our other presenters provided a bibliography about kind of what he'd spoken about, and that's, I think, under his video on the website, it's added there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're always trying to add and provide information for everybody because we get a lot of questions similar. Mm-hmm. So let me see if I can get one more good question here.
My sister-in-law asked a really good question. I'm gonna tease her.
There you go.
I don't know why my sister-in-law, Sarah Warren, decided to spend an hour with me. But she asks, do the Native communities receive any residual funding from the communities that use their history to inspire tourism and revenue generation? That's a great question. And the answer is no. So I think what I love about your question, Sally, is, this brings us back to this point about appropriation, right? In the 20th century, the story of Tecumseh has been appropriated by white people and retold in a number of different ways to suit their own agendas and their own purposes for entirely their own benefit. And, this just isn't the way anyone should go about telling anyone's story. I think that it's incumbent upon Ohioans to do better.
Yeah. I keep drawing down every time somebody else asks the question or comments.
Well, that's so interesting. So Jasper Wa Quasabar asks, can you speak to the connection, if you see one, between Tecumseh and the labor movement in Southeast Ohio's coal fields in the late 19th century? The town of Shawnee, Ohio was a major organizing site for miners that went on to found the UMWA. Wow, I had no idea, Jasper. I think that's super interesting. And so I don't know anything about this specific area of Ohio, Jasper, but I take in your question that you think that this idea of racial scripts and sort of the story of Native people jumping the tracks and being used to sort of explain labor or racial unrest with African Americans, you think that's a thing in Ohio? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Would it be okay if I talked for a second?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, hi, I'm a folklorist in Ohio, and I work with folks who live in Shawnee, Ohio. And it was a group of Black and white and largely recent immigrant white folks too, from Eastern Europe, who were the folks who were founding the labor movement And in Shawnee, the landmark building from that turn of that time is the Tecumseh Theater. So, you know, I don't know very much about, you know, how people were embracing those images or using the image of Tecumseh, but there is sort of maybe an inversion of kind of what you're talking about in terms of the spirit pushing back against the sort of white supremacist leanings of the coal operators and keeping down Black and immigrant miners in Southeast Ohio. So thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Jasper. And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much winding down. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And this conversation has been interesting. This presentation will be available probably in about a week and a half, because it takes me a bit of time to add captions to it, which I like to do before I make it broadly available, so that way everybody can access it. So yeah, it'll be on our website. I'll post about it on our social media once it's available again. And yeah, did you have something, Steve?
I just wanted to say that it was a real honor to speak with you all. And it's such a pleasure to see so many old friends, new friends. And I hope that we all get a chance to visit sometime about this. So be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
No way, Steve.
Hi, Carl.
All right. Have a good evening, everybody.